Lots of people think that since October 7th, the media has suddenly got really unfair and biased. But as I know, and as you know, because you were head of the Israeli government press office when we first met some 20 odd years ago, when I was a correspondent in Jerusalem for British and American newspapers, as you and I know, this bias is actually not new. It's been there for decades. And too many people maybe look in a short term and think that it's just something that's happened since October 7th. It's been growing, but it's been there before too, unfortunately.
Well, you give me a lot of things to try to address here. Maybe I'll go with the last thing that you said. That's the thing we have most experience with. We encountered, or I encountered and was aware, because you were quite critical yourself back then, and you were also one that expected, like any normal person would be, you expected the journalists would hold themselves to the standards of journalism. Do you think there was a sincere effort to try to improve it? Or, as you said, the more it became more difficult for them and the more they get called out, they just said, the hell with it, we'll go with what we know and not worry about what people have to say?
Well, I think some journalists are actually making more of an effort, although they're failing often, but they're not trying to be biased. And if you remember, in the old days, there were people for the BBC like Orla Guerin and Barbara Flett, and they were kind of, I'm going to use a strong word, rabid against Israel. In fact, it's hard to show viewers text because it takes long, but I just before this interview, I found 3 cartoons from 20 years ago from 3 different countries, just to show people who today say, oh, it's all about Netanyahu, it's all about the Gaza war. If Israel had a different government, it wouldn't be like that. If they weren't involved in Gaza against Hamas, the coverage would be better. And I say, no, this one is from Norway of Ehud Olmert, who was prime minister. He's basically comparing him to a scene from Schindler's List. It's an image from Schindler's List where he's the SS commandant Goethe who's shooting down at prisoners. And it's definitely...
And this is Ehud Olmert from when he was prime minister nearly 20 years ago.
The cartoon's from 2006 when he was prime minister, from the third largest newspaper in Norway. Also from 2006, we're going to cross the world to New Zealand. And here we have, on the top, we have the Twin Towers, the 9/11 attacks by Al-Qaeda in New York. On the bottom, we have Beirut. This is during the 2006 Second Lebanon War. So here we have a cartoonist in a mainstream New Zealand newspaper comparing Israel to Al-Qaeda, okay? And I'll just give you a third example. I've got many, many more. And this is from even a conservative newspaper, one that I myself used to work for, the Daily Telegraph in London. At the top it says Warsaw 1943. In the bottom, Tyre in Lebanon 2006. It is comparing the Warsaw ghetto uprising, the Nazis, to Israel. This is 2006 in a conservative newspaper, not in the newspapers we're used to being very anti-Israel, which tend to be liberal left, like the New York Times, the Guardian, Washington Post, BBC. The Telegraph, to be fair, and to answer your earlier question, it is being pretty fair to Israel and highlighting the hostages and nowadays it's not running to judgment. So if anything, there are segments of the media that maybe are more careful, even positively supportive of Israel. For example, in Britain, where I'm from, the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, 2 big newspapers, Spectator magazine, and so on. So all I'm trying to establish here, before we might go into why this is the case and what are the ramifications of it, is anybody who thinks this is something solely connected to Israel's current war against Hamas and Gaza is not correct. And anyone who thinks it's solely linked to the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu is the prime minister, not correct. I've also got cartoons comparing Ehud Barak when he was prime minister for the Labour Party, comparing him to Hitler. I got also Ariel Sharon when he was prime
Of
minister.
course, Arik Sharon was one of the biggest villains.
I'd even got Shimon Peres, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, comparing him to a Nazi. And we're talking about mainstream publications. So again, I think mainstream publications are probably a bit careful, because if the internet was widespread in 2006, and to remind people, those cartoons from 2006, YouTube hadn't started. I think Facebook started that year. I don't think Instagram had started. Twitter was maybe in its infancy. So there was no way of pushing back, except someone like me who was writing. That's why I got those cartoons. I criticized them at the time, but by and large, a lot of these newspapers got away with it because there was no real ability to push back. So there is the ability to push back, but just like anti-Semitism is a virus that evolves into different kind of mutates in different formats, anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism disguised as anti-Zionism has also mutated. So I don't want to say it's not here now. It's just maybe a slightly different form today.
No, that this is amazing. You reminded me a few of the things that we had to deal with back then. I dealt with the journalists who were here physically, so I could address the I would say things that they found necessary or they just overlooked. A lot of the things that we're discovering recently, such as the fact that they're employing known members of terrorist organizations. And to their credit, we'll say, well, they had no other choice. If they want to cover the events there, then they have to, because these terrorists, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah or even the PLO, or by the way, even the King of Jordan, they make, if you want to have a local a presence in their areas, you have to employ people that they agree. And this way they're employing terrorists. Now, if they were open about it and would tell us or the readers, viewers, listeners that we've been asked to employ these people or we have to employ these particular people, and I would say, fine, we understand where they're coming from. But they would usually hide it. And even to this day, we see how they're very defensive of these people, although there are photographs of them with weapons. Although after they're killed in the battlefield, these organizations hail them as being these great martyrs. And yet the media continue to insist that they were objective journalists working for these different organizations. So in a sense, it's not that things have changed. It's just now we're more aware of it. As you said, the social media is exposing all these things. I have to ask, what is this? Maybe this is not on our level of expertise. What is this obsession with comparing Israel to Nazis and to Nazi activities? It's
Well, my own theory, and I've written about this, is that some Europeans feel guilty. They feel guilty, and rightly so, because the Nazi Holocaust was not only committed by Germans and Austrians. Pretty much every country in Europe, or every country that's occupied, collaborated in the roundup of Jews. At least many people did. Many countries, from the French government to the Dutch to the Hungarians, Croats, Ukrainians, Baltic states, and so on. And then there are other governments like the United States and Britain that didn't collaborate. Of course, they were on the right side, but they didn't do what they could have done, both before the Holocaust in taking refugees. And we know that, the famous cases like the St. Louis, the ship with lots of German Jews was turned back by the United States to their deaths. Or Britain took some people on the Kindertransport, but they didn't take these children's brothers and sisters and parents. And even worse, we know that during the war, the Americans and British deliberately chose not to bomb the railway lines to Auschwitz because they didn't want to they didn't want to divert the German war effort from murdering Jews. So I think what I've seen is over the last 20, 30 years, there's been a lot more attention to the Holocaust in history, museums, media, films. We think, younger people would think, we've been interested in it for 80 years, but no, for decades, Holocaust memoirs, they couldn't find publishers. Eddie Wiesel couldn't find a publisher. Premium Levy couldn't find a publisher. It's only in the 1990s with Steven Spielberg making Schindler's List that it's the first really big film connected to the Holocaust. And Tony Blair, who was then the British Prime Minister, literally said, gosh, this is bad. And he introduced it onto the British school curriculum as part of World War II history. But when I was at school, which was slightly just before then, it wasn't on the curriculum. It was never mentioned in my schooling, the Holocaust, even though we studied World War II. So as there's been more and more awareness of the Holocaust, there's a lot of kind of guilt or maybe just trying to wriggle out of it. So if people in the West, academics, media, and others, can somehow betray the Jewish state of behaving in an almost Nazi-like way, that somehow either reduces their guilt about the Holocaust, or it even retroactively somehow justifies it to say, well, if the Jews are like Nazis, then, you know, first of all, we shouldn't be judged for the Holocaust. There's some kind of parallel, which is, of course, nonsense. There is no parallel. Even if Israel was guilty of everything that Hamas claim, which is that 53 or 55,000 people have died in Gaza in the last 2 years, 20,000 of which were civilians. And by the way, those figures were almost certainly exaggerated. But even if it was 33,000 civilians and 20,000 Hamas, I mean, just Badi Yar, or just, which is the massacre in Ukraine, or just Rumbala, which is a massacre outside Riga in 2 days in Latvia, with more people executed, children, gas chambers, medical experiments. It's nonsense. And it's a kind of dilution of the Holocaust that goes with the exaggeration of any supposed Israeli crimes. And I read this as it's a kind of form of anti-Semitism, but it's also kind of like, let's negate what really happened in the Holocaust. Let's water it all down so that everything's genocide. You know, on the first week after October 7th, in demonstrations in London, they're already saying, stop the genocide. It was about 2 days after October 7th. What is this? I mean, even if, and it's a huge if, you could say it's some kind of form of genocide if 20,000 people are killed, which is nonsense. It's just, this is what happens in war, unfortunately. But how on earth could they say that a couple of days after October 7th, before the war had barely started? It's like they're desperate to have a genocide in order to say, oh, look at those horrible Jews, they're the real Nazis.
Well, I think that fits into what I say in my opening. I talk about the fact that for years we knew that there's a propaganda machine working that immediately starts once they start losing their effort. They attack Israel, and then when Israel responds, we know we had a certain period of time before they start putting pressure on the international community to hold Israel back. And part of it is coming out with these accusations. So it's surprising how quickly it was like they knew that this was going to happen, and within hours, they were ready with a response to divert attention away from what they had done, the atrocities they committed against Israel, to divert attention away to that, to start applying pressure on Israel. It's failed because a year and a half later, a year and 7, 8 months later, it's quite clear now that what they used to do for years is not working this time because Israelis have had enough. I just want to conclude with... Can
I just add one thing, though?
Yes.
There are those people who are actively campaigning to destroy the Jewish state, to destroy Israel, who immediately launched demonstrations, whether in Harvard or Columbia University, or the streets of London or Paris or Sweden or Berlin. But I'm also talking about another group of people, which is people in the media, okay, or people in universities who almost subconsciously and not sure they're even aware what they're doing, because anti-Semitism is so deep, and people think, you know, people in their ignorance think, well, it started in 1933 when Hitler came to power, and it finished in 1945 when the Nazis lost the war. Well, no, it's thousands of years globally, or most of the globe. And where do people think anti-Semitism just went in 1945? They think it just disappeared?
Right.
Of course not. It was just covered up a bit. but it pops out in a way that people might not even aware what they're doing. So I'm not talking about the people who immediately, um, active campaigners on the streets to the river to the sea. I'm talking about something more subtle among people who should know better, and clever people, some of which are my friends who I went to university with and worked in politics or media. And it just pops out. They say things to me in London. They make these comparisons to Nazis.
It's amazing because I had that experience with a journalist from a prominent British station here, who was a relative of a prominent British politician. And she was about to leave Israel. This was during the Lebanon War, the second Lebanon War back in the early 2000s. And we were talking, and she had a few, she drank a little alcohol. And it was amazing, the conversation. I said something that she interpreted as being a connection to the Holocaust. I wasn't. I was talking about Israel. But I mentioned how there was 6 million Israeli Jews in Israel, that we're a minority in the Middle East. And she took that, the moment I said 6 million, she immediately thought I was talking about the Holocaust. And she went on this tirade about how, oh, there you go again, invoking the Holocaust. And then she went into this, you know what, in the beer halls of Munich, they would have been applauding her at that moment. And here she was, somebody who I maybe disagreed with politically, but I did respect her for her professionalism that she portrayed, and but that came out in that 1 minute. And I think many of us are experiencing this recently, like you said, with friends, with people that we expected a little more from. And here, the journalists are supposed to be educated, people who go to college. That's one of the reasons that I am very disappointed with a lot of the media and my experiences with the media.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. People need to understand more that anti-Semitism was never, or not in modern times, primarily some kind of working class phenomenon. If you look at Nazi Germany, at the forefront were university professors and students and media. And, one statistic I always give is the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra. At a time when Vienna was maybe, with Berlin, the most sophisticated country in the world. 1/3 of the Vienna Philharmonic was Jewish. Many of them were murdered, others fled. But 1/3 volunteered to join the SS. 1/3 of the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra. These aren't just thugs. A few days ago, we see the assassination of the 2 young Israeli diplomats, Yaron and Sarah, in Washington. The Yaron, as I understood, grew up in Germany. Humboldt University, which is in Mitte, in the center of Berlin, had a kind of celebratory placard celebrating his death, saying he deserved it as a Zionist. And people online were saying, oh my God, what a shock. Humboldt University would say that. How can they? But I say, listen, if you know about the history, Humboldt University expelled expelled all its Jewish students in 1933. And then 20,000 books by Jews and others were burned by professors and students at Humboldt. It's not new. And I think some of it is pure hate, but some of it is because people have not been educated, even a lot of Jews and Israelis have not been educated about just how pathological and deep anti-Semitism is. And maybe I'm hopeful if there was more self-understanding, if everyone who worked for the New York Times or BBC or all university professors or teachers in Western Europe or North America, if they went on a course to really understand that, at least some of them, I think, will be more self-aware and try and avoid that and try to be reasonable in their criticism of Israel, not inflammatory in a way that leads to anti-Semitism.
Well, you sort of went into something I was going to conclude with. Is there anything positive you can say, or anything direction you think that could be positive with all that is happening right now? I remember back in 2011, when the first time we saw how positive social media was in allowing us to get our message out there. Do you see anything developing now out of all that's going on that perhaps we can be hopeful about?
Yes, there is something very positive, but people also don't believe me when I tell them this. I, for years, have met all kinds of people in the Arab world. I'm not talking about second generation children of Pakistani and Bangladeshis in London or Moroccans and Algerians in Paris. I've been to Qatar, to Iraq, and I've met Syrians and elsewhere. And there is a relative lack of anti-Semitism in a lot of Arab countries and acceptance or even admiration of Israel. I mean, I recently spent time listening to Syrians, for example, Syrians from Syria, not Syrians living in Germany. And there is a growing acceptance of Israel. There's a growing knowledge about the Holocaust. For example, in Morocco, they teach it on the school curriculum. And at least to some extent, as there's reduction in Islam in Saudi Arabia and, sorry, I'm just putting the phone on silence, on Saudi Arabia and Iran, a lot of people, there's less Islam. There isn't that much sympathy for the Palestinians, and there's a kind of slowly recognition that Israel is part of the region, recognizing that they can learn something from the Jews, that they've got some, it's a benefit to have Israel as a state. It's not just the countries who did the Abraham Accords. I, for example, had lunch with the Saudi ambassador to London, with the first cousin of the Crown Prince, MBS. All of them very pro-Israel. We had a few of them from the Saudi embassy. Like I said, I did in Kurdistan. But the real problem is where there was historic anti-Semitism among Europeans, especially maybe West Europeans, Canadians, Americans, Australians. So I'd say that slowly, the direction of travel in much of the Arab world, not in Egypt, not in Gaza, but in much of the Arab world, is actually positive. I'm a little bit, I'm cautiously positive about changes in Syria and Lebanon, society, Israel, for example. Iranians, most Iranians who don't support the regime are bigger Zionists than a lot of people in Tel Aviv, to be honest. In fact, I'm serious. Netanyahu has more support in Tehran than he does in Tel Aviv.
He also in Syria and in Lebanon,
yes.
to the how yes. ironic as it is.
Yes, that's for another episode about why Netanyahu is not the most popular person in the Israeli left. But so yes, I'd like to conclude by saying it's a very serious problem in the West, especially in universities, but also in media and a younger generation of progressive politicians, and also the children or grandchildren of a lot of Muslim immigrants. They can be very anti-Semitic in France, Belgium, Holland, Sweden, Britain. But in the Arab world itself, it's more of a political problem. So yes, we have to find some resolution that gives a better life to Palestinians. We have to maybe have a accommodation between religions, but I don't see that historic anti-Semitism, that very deep anti-Semitism so much in the Arab world as I do in the West.
Well, you're basically saying that these migrants to Europe very quickly became, unfortunately, picked up the negative aspects of Europe and not the positive ones. Tom Gross, want to thank you for being with us, and I love the message you give us at the end, because these are the people we're going to have to deal with, our neighbors here, and you give us very good insights onto where we're going to go with this. So, Tom Gross, thank you very much.
Thank you, Danny.